So what I'll have you do, and this will be the only time you actually look into the camera lens, is introduce yourself.
Okay.
Tell us what class you just taught and what school we're at.
Okay. Hi, my name is Gonyou. I just taught a lesson on algebraic thinking, kind of an intro lesson to algebra. And I am here at Mendive Middle School teaching 6th grade.
Excellent.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to go through these questions here. They may be robotic sounding just because I have to ask the same questions every time, but we'll just jump right in. We want to understand the decisions you made in planning for this lesson and how it fits into the unit and year. So how does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before this lesson and what will come after it? Discuss the sequence of lessons that surround this one lesson.
Okay. This lesson for me was a kind of an introduction lesson to algebraic thinking. My students, being very bright, tend to come in with a lot of pre-existing knowledge. I was pretty certain that they had an idea what a variable was and what an equation was, and they were able to articulate that. Most of them knew kind of what we mean by substitution, but I really wanted to validate before we actually got into solving equations and getting into that level of algebra that they really validated the use of substitution as a quality way in which to prove that their work is correct. They don't need my answer key. They merely substitute the values, and if they create an equality, then they know that they were correct. I was pretty certain that they did not know the term coefficient, but I purposely included an example on coefficient because it is included also in some of their problems that they solved in the lab. When I leave this lesson and move on in this unit, what I will be having them do is learn to solve equations with manipulatives. I like the idea of manipulatives. A lot of them can cognitively do it, and they're frustrated with me making them set up variables, set up numbers. But then they comprehend how an equation truly operates with numbers and variables, and then the transition off of manipulatives is much smoother with greater understanding.
Awesome. All right, so talk about the standards or cluster targeted in this lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of that standard or cluster?
The lesson was from equations and expressions, and I believe it was number 5, something like that. And what it asked the students to do is to validate whether an equality or inequality was true using substitution. It also referred to the use of a solution set. So I made sure when I patterned the practice that number 1, they had a solution set, that they had to use substitution. The lesson that they did together as a lab was all equalities, but their homework also has a small piece on inequalities, which I wanted to make sure all those elements were included when I put together not only the lesson itself, but the follow-up homework that had them utilize those skills and solve equations.
Excellent. Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplified, and how did you plan for this?
One of the big transitions, of course, is into Common Core and looking at how we increase depth and complexity. We do a lot of cooperative learning in Common Core, and there were several things about this that I thought fit that shift very well. One was that the equations that they solved escalated in difficulty. I have students who solve equations very quickly, do anything mathematically very quickly. And I have other students who need more time. So it allowed for those groups to go at the pace that their group was best at. I did not put any requirement that they had to finish the lab. They got as far as they could. And even if they didn't finish a level, I think that discussion towards solution is of value. And so I think that's good. When I established these groups, one of the things I really paid attention to were not only my students who were at the upper end of comprehension in algebraic thinking, but I also put students together who processed at a similar pace, because I had a couple of groups in this room who just took longer to solve, but did very well. And if I put those students who solve slowly in a group where students solve quickly, they just write down the answers and they don't have the time or the opportunity to learn the understandings. So I also did that with the groups.
All right. So now we'll move on to the next section. We are interested in how the shifts required by the CCSS are being incorporated into your classroom. Discuss this lesson. Sorry. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
I think a lot of it is the depth and complexity. And one of the things that I've taught for lots of years, and one of the things that's completely different now than it was certainly when I began, especially in mathematics. We tended to do lots of practice problems, and it was more of a how-to, it was more of a skill-based. But the shift to Common Core is, why is that so? Why is that significant? How important are these steps that we do? And what I've found has changed a lot is, number one, I'm 24/7 active in the math classroom. When it was skill-based, you taught it, you sat up at your desk, and they worked away. Now you're constantly monitoring the groups to see if they're engaged, to perceive if they are struggling, if they need some scaffolding so that they can be more successful. And it's behavior also, but most of them are pretty motivated and pretty well behaved. But I think that's important. Also, homework, it might not be unusual to do 20, 30 problems. It's rare that they have more than 6, 8 problems to do for homework, but my expectation is different. I may not assign homework every night, and some nights there's one problem, but I want to know their thinking. And even if the answer isn't correct, I want to know exactly what they tried to get the correct answer, which is a big shift in, especially in mathematics. Am I right? Am I right? I don't know. What's your thoughts? And that's what I want to focus on.
All right, excellent. And you talked a little bit about this, but I don't know if you want to expand on it. How did you teach the content of this lesson prior to the CCSS? What is the same and what is different?
I have a manipulative set that I've had for a number of years that has taught students how to solve equations with manipulatives, and I love it, and I've found it wonderful. It's called Hands-On Equations. But I think doing more of a conceptual intro, I still had a tendency, as I've made this transition, to want to start with solving equations, which is where I want to start in algebra. And I felt it was important with Common Core to begin to look at what is algebraic thinking? How can we use the information we have? What strategies are effective in determining solution and validating whether we're successful or not?
All right. So student engagement is critical to the work of the CCSS. We want to understand how you ensured that all students had the opportunity to productively engage in the work of the lesson. So how did you, how did the students handle this lesson? Did they understand the mathematics of the lesson, and how did you know?
I think they did a real good job with the lesson. I was really pleased. There are several things I did. This lab is established in a perfect way. It has three cards that all have white dots and one card that has a black dot. So I established early on that whoever had the black dot one time did not the next. There was a series of manipulatives, and that role was shifted throughout the group. So I wanted different people taking the different roles in the group. Also, when they indicated to me, we are ready to move on, we can prove that we are correct, then I really tried to make sure a different student responded each time. So I knew that they were all engaged in solution. With a highly verbal class, there's a lot of competition in here, and you have a group of 5 very verbal people, and they want to tell me how they solved it every time. And so I tried as best I could recollect, if this student responded the last time, then I want to make sure that student is not the one who responds the next time. So I involve the other students.
Oh, that's good. A little mix there. Sort of similar question. How did you differentiate in this lesson? Did all students have opportunities to work on grade level content? If students did not have this opportunity, please explain why.
One of the wonderful things, as I kind of indicated earlier, is that the first thing I did when I established my groups is I looked at not only who are my higher and not as quick functioning students, and tried to put those that required more time to process in one group together, because there is that impatience with that student who solves things quickly. It was differentiated in that they could move forward when they were ready. And again, I did not make it a requirement to finish the lab. My students are very competitive. If they know their 4 levels, they want to get through all 4. They know that. This activity is grade leveled, according to the resources, 2 through 9, and these are 6th graders. I knew they could be very successful with their first set, and hopefully fairly successful with their second set. But I knew by levels 3 and 4, they were getting into higher cognition. And some of my students are ready for that, and some of them are not, which is why I did not require the lab to be finished. But it also means that my students who are ready to advance can, and those, everybody got to level 3, which is beyond 6th grade, it pulled them all a little farther along than they were to begin with.
Excellent. Which behaviors from Core Action 3 did students best exemplify in this lesson? And what actions have you taken as a teacher to make that happen?
I have tried to find lots of opportunities to do a variety of things with these students, and to find ways to validate that they're successful. I do a lot of cooperative grouping. I do assign roles often. There's different viewpoints on cooperative grouping. I do have bright students, but I find it much more effective in cooperative grouping to have similar level students. I think it's a travesty for both the high and low to blend abilities. What happens is the student who is high is frustrated because the pace is not good, and the student who is on the lower end of things is frustrated because they just don't get it. And the higher student pretty much says, it's 4, deal with it, and moves on. And so I like grouping them in same level groups so that they can all learn together. That also is very easy for me as a teacher too, to scaffold to make them successful. They're always individually accountable, but they have each other to support and learn together. And I like the discussion that takes them to that point of, what were you thinking? Well, how do you know that's correct? Explain where you got to and how you got to that point.
Okay. All right. On the home stretch here, these are great answers. Would you like to comment on any of the submitted student work? Was there something that delighted or surprised you?
I made it pretty standardized in what I expected of the students. I required that they show me at least one strategy. I know with a couple of the groups, when I got around, I noticed that 2 of the students had strategies and 3 of them didn't. And I said, I'll be back when you have your strategies listed, and then we'll move forward. So they knew that was an expectation. I just think it's important for them to articulate the why. And it is the hardest thing we do in Common Core. Most of them can get to solution. If they have to tell me how they got there, a lot of them are just tongue-tied. Well, I don't know. I just know it is. Well, think back. What were the steps? And they were able to show me. So I think sometimes doing those sorts of things, of having every student required to follow through, is important. Some of my students who don't like to write a lot wrote less. My students who like to write a lot wrote more. But everybody had to write something before their group could proceed. And after the first question, they knew that, and they talked the strategies because they all knew they had to write them. And so I thought that was a valid way of getting that accomplished. I did notice when I had gone through, I had set this up and went vocabulary, practice, problem 1, 2, 3, 4. And some of my students, believe it or not, did vocabulary, practice, and then did 1 up here, even though it was number 2. And so I just pointed that out, and I said, it's no big deal, just change that to 1, make this one 2. So it surprised me, I guess, and being English speaking, I probably should have gone left, right, and for some reason, I in my mind had it going this way, but it's also, it's not a big deal. As long as I can find that they've responded to each question, if they would have gone from top left to bottom right, I would have adjusted and been able to look at it. But I was just surprised. To me, it was so clear what I was doing that I realized, well, sure, I understand what they're doing. And that makes sense also.
All right. So reflecting on the lesson, what worked particularly well and what might you do differently? You sort of talked about that a little bit, but.
I think the lesson is effective. I have done this lesson before, and I find, at level 1, they're ready quick. And so it's getting around, and I had to find, I'm a very impatient person myself, and 39 years of teaching has taught me a fair amount of patience, but what I had to do is just kind of steel myself to stay with a group until the explanation of their solution was done before I went to another group, even though I knew I had 3 groups frantically waving their hands and ready to move forward. And so that is something, I don't know how I change that, but I also know that I have to take the time to listen to the processing because that's the valuable piece. I also felt maybe the first part was a little slow. So it may have been that maybe I picked a question or a system of equations that they could solve a little easier and have a little more hint early on. But I like that they struggled when we were all together. If I gave them an easier one, they're not really prepared to struggle when they get to it independently. So maybe tweaking that a little bit of how to pace up that first part a little. My kids don't want to listen any more than I do. They want to just do. They're used to labs. They're used to that high energy. They're used to experimenting with different possibilities. So they want to get to the meat, as do I. But you have to take the time to set the stage.
All right. And this is the last question here. Were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors or reactions?
I think most of them were enthusiastic. I think I told you earlier I had a couple boys who were playing footsie under the table. And, I know how to deal with discipline. And it was just awkward for me being filmed of how to address that. I did, my husband grew up in a family that his father gave them the hairy eyeball, which was kind of a leering look that said, stop misbehaving. And I did give the boys a little bit of a hairy eyeball and they put their feet back where they belonged. But, I just, I've spent some time talking with them that I just expect them to do the best they can. And there'll be things they get stuck on. I wanted them to feel comfortable and confident. And so I was just surprised that they were still going to be themselves after that. So, but they are what they are. They're 6th grade boys.
Well, excellent. That was a great interview.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You are